From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, welcome. I'm Mark Harwitz. It's my pleasure to get to introduce my friend Warren Hoffman and to give you a little background. Warren is currently the Associate Director of Community Programming for the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. He served as the Senior Director of Programming at the Gershwin Y, where he innovated new programs and was named the, quote, next wave of Jewish culture by the Jewish Exponent. In the world of theater, Warren was the literary manager and dramaturg for the Philadelphia Theater Company, where he dramaturged world premieres by writers including Terrence McNally, Chris Durang, and Bill Irwin. He was the Associate Artistic Director of Jewish Repertory Theater and a writer and reviewer for TalkinBroadway.com, where he covered the off-Broadway and cabaret scene. He holds a PhD in American Literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He earned rave reviews for his books, The Passing Game, Queering Jewish American Culture. His most recent book is The Great White Way, Race in the Broadway Musical. Warren is also a playwright and a core writer with Interact Theater Company. It occurs to me that his books deal with both sex and race, so I'm curious to see what his next thing is going to be. And just on a personal side note, it's particularly, I'm always thrilled when people come here who've actually done research in our collections, and Warren certainly did that. But what's particularly special, I think, about his work is it's not just the researching the history, but then what he's done with it to sort of an intellectual examination and a critical consideration of things and kind of putting things together through his own intellect and knowledge and all of that. So it's really a sort of a unique book, I think, that way. Before Warren comes in, I've been told to tell you two things. The exhibit that is partly related to the talk today, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, A Long Way Struggle for Freedom, is upstairs. So after this, you might want to take a look at that. Warren's both books are on sale in the back, and I encourage you to buy both of them and support Warren and the arts. And related to musical theater events, on October 23rd, Stu will be talking at 7 o'clock in the Montpelier Room. I wasn't told to tell you about this, but next Friday, there's also Broadway songwriters performing their works. Is a concert in the Coolidge that I'm excited about. So without further ado, here's Warren.
Hi, everybody. So thanks for coming out today. I know it's probably lunch hour for some of you, so it's great to be here. Thanks to the Library of Congress, to Nick, to Mark. It's now, of course, an honor to be here at the Library of Congress. But as Mark said, it was great to work in the archives here, so I feel like this project has now come for a full circle, and I get to sort of share what I discovered with a larger audience. So, question for all of you. How many of you are musical theater fans? Okay, great. How many of you go to musicals because you like the singing and the dancing? Some, okay. Some of you didn't raise your hand. Okay, that's okay. I guess you wouldn't go to the musical then. How many of you go to musicals to learn more about the racial politics of the United States? It's like, I'm surprised that not everybody raised their hands because to me, the musical actually is very much invested in the racial politics of the US, often in ways that we're not always aware of or not thinking about. But today I hope to sort of change your perspective on that, and maybe by the end you'll think about musicals in a different way. So often when people hear the topic race in the Broadway musical, a few shows might come to mind. Dreamgirls, perhaps South Pacific, Flower Drum Song. But I want us to think beyond shows like this today, and we're going to begin with a short clip from a show that you might not think has anything to do with race, but I want to make a case that it does. So we're going to look at an excerpt from a clip from the 1980 musical 42nd Street. This is the opening number. Ignore the Japanese subtitles. It's in English. This was the Broadway company. This was actually filmed for Japanese television, hence the subtitles. But let's give me a moment here, and we're going to take a look, and then I'll tell you about it. Okay, for time's sake, I'm going to stop it. It's a great number. How many of you are familiar with 42nd Street? Based on the 1933 movie of a young chorus girl, Peggy Sawyer, who gets her big break and gets to star in a big Broadway show. So this is the opening to 42nd Street. It begins with an audition with people trying to get into the show. What I want to tie the racial element, we'll get a clue to it in a very short speech. So this is a speech that preceded the Japanese airing of this musical. And we're going to hear from Claire Leach, who stars as Peggy Sawyer. And I want you to listen to what she has to say about this musical. So this ideology that Claire Leach puts out, one that might say is sort of the text of the Broadway musical, that if you work hard and have talent, you too can star in the Broadway show. But if by this logic, we should have, or answer this question, why has there never been an African-American actress playing the role of Peggy Sawyer? Now one might say, of course, well, the show takes place in the 1930s, when such a casting option wouldn't have been possible. But the point is, she sets it up as if the American dream is open to anybody, when in fact there really is a racial, let's say, glass ceiling to what people can achieve, unfortunately, in the US. I want to push this even further, though. So this show, really, it's a throwback to the 1930s, but it comes out in 1980, and it runs for almost 8 years during almost the exact same period of the Reagan administration. And what's happening politically in the U.S. during this time, in the beginning of the 80s through that decade? It's the beginning of affirmative action in this country. Really taking off, a policy trying to give minorities a leg up in society, and there was a lot of pushback, anti-affirmative action rhetoric and action in the US, a lot coming out of the Reagan administration, saying that why should we be giving jobs or places away to anybody? You should get a position by hard work and talent. Isn't that the same rhetoric that we're hearing Claire Leach say? That's the Broadway sort of spirit. And so I want us to think about how these sort of ideologies are very much infused in musicals, even though we might not be thinking about them that way. So with that as our sort of starting point, I'm going to give you sort of an overview of sort of the main points of the book, and I'm going to take you quickly through the different chapters in musicals. We're going to look at some clips and listen to some things, and off we go. So I want to begin with a quote from Richard Wright, African-American author of Native Son, and he says, "There isn't any Negro problem, there is only a white problem." And I like this quote because he sort of turns around how I think we think about race at times in the US. That often we think about race as something having to do, or exclusively about people of color, but we tend to sort of miss how whites fit into all of this. Their complicity, how whiteness is also a race. And so I like the way that he turns this on its head. And so my book very much is about the connection between whiteness and the Broadway musical. So here are some of the sort of pull-out ideas. So first, musicals are not just fanciful entertainments. I asked all of you at the beginning, why do you go to musicals? And many people say it's for the singing and the dancing. And of course, that is why we go. But I want us to think beyond that. And musicals are very powerful forms of entertainment, I believe, because they can say things in ways that are very palatable and almost, I think at times miss over them. So it might seem almost a contradiction, but they're actually more powerful because they seem to be about nothing at all. They seem to be just about tap dancing when there's actually a lot going on the stage. So I want us to look beyond that veneer of entertainment. Second idea, musicals and whiteness share a great deal in common. So this actually develops on this first idea. So musicals, as I was just saying, seem to, again, be about nothing at all. They're just, fun entertainment, and yet at the same time, there's something, I would say, deeper going on behind them. Whiteness, I would actually argue, works the same way. It seems to be raceless. It seems to be the norm, the universal. It seems to be nothing at all. And it's precisely because it seems to be blank, to be invisible, to be white, that's where its power comes from. It doesn't mark itself, and it's able, therefore, to put itself out in the world and exercise the power it does in our society, often by erasing itself. If that, again, it seems like a contradiction, but that's how I see those things. And so again, I think the musicals and Whiteness seem very connected because they both seem to be about nothing, and yet there's a lot of depth to them. Many musicals uphold an interest in white supremacy. When I put this up, there's a lot of head scratching. People get confused. They think, what does this mean? Is it, the KKK putting on a production of Annie, Get Your Gun? That's not what I mean. I want us to think about white supremacy in different terms. It is can, of course, sadly be violent acts of violence committed against non-whites. But white supremacy has also been defined by a scholar such as George Lipsitz, who talks about any action or policy that basically supports or has an investment in white identity. Economic policies, hiring policies, things that people don't always see, but are very much have a hierarchy going on. So anything that sort of supports white identity over other types of racial identities, one can argue is an example of white supremacy. And a lot of musicals, again, privilege whites in ways over other races, and so musicals are invested in this policy. Again, I think we're going to see some of that as we go along. And so the final idea is, a very big statement, the history of the American musical is the history of white identity in the United States. So first off, I want to say that white identity, but also all racial identities, have changed over time. And to give you an example, to talk particularly about whiteness for a moment, if we think about the history of immigration in this country, the turn of the 20th century, and we think about groups such as Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants coming to this country in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these individuals, despite what the color of their skin might have looked like, were not viewed as white in the way that we sort of view whiteness today. In that time, whiteness was particularly was reserved for Anglo-Saxons, and these groups were in their own sort of special category of whiteness, we might say. As the 20th century goes on, those groups I just mentioned become incorporated into a larger Caucasian category. And so this change of race, this change of whiteness, is actually mirrored in different shows. And there's one in particular we're going to look at that really, I think, brings this to the forefront. So, by looking at these shows are products of their time periods, and they're not just these fanciful entertainments. They are ways that we can learn more about the United States, even though we think it's just a lot of tap dancing and fancy sets. So, with that said, the first show that the book looks at is Showboat. It's 1927. Many ways, it's a major musical for so many reasons. Basically, the first major Broadway musical to feature an integrated cast on stage, black and white actors performing together. How many of you are familiar with Showboat? Oh, good. Okay. It's one of the, basically, it has an important part in musical theater history because it's really the first really serious musical that is dealing with issues of race, of course, of what was then called miscegenation. There's a black actress who's married to a white actor who is illegal at this time. The actress is passing as white. There are issues of alcoholism, spousal abandonment, things that people didn't think about that you could actually musicalize. But Jerome Kern, the composer, and Oscar Hammerstein, the librettist and lyricist, thought that this was substantial material to compose a musical around. There's a lot. I do talk about these sort of the white issues in the book, and I'm going to leave that for there. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Showboat today. But I do want to point out this picture that you're looking at on the screen. Even though Showboat, I think, really was an advanced musical for its day, it was dealing with major issues. These white actors on a showboat, traveling up and down the Mississippi, and the black servants who were able to sort of make their lives possible. We're looking here at a picture of Tess Gardella, who played Queenie. Queenie serves in the pantry of the Showboat. And for all of its advanced sophistication in 1927, this is Tess Gardella in blackface playing Queenie. And Tess Gardella was also known as, she was the original Aunt Jemima. And to the best of my knowledge, there was no other actress in any production that followed it that did Queenie in blackface. But you know, it is still a problematic show, I think, for issues like this and how it was dealing with race. So I'll leave that out there. But again, the book goes into more details about sort of how whites and blacks sort of perform their identities on the Showboat in this musical. But we're going to sort of jump in time to another very important musical, Oklahoma, from 1943. And when I tell people that this book is a book about race, includes Oklahoma, I get a lot of sort of head scratching, like, what does this show have to do with race? It's about, you know, farmers and cowboys in the, you know, the Great West, you know, conquering the frontier. But you know, Oklahoma is an important musical for a bunch of reasons. It's, many people say, the first integrated musical, not racially integrated, but integrated in the way that it was joining song and story together in very sophisticated ways. And it features music by Richard Rodgers and book and lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein of Showboat fame, who we were just talking about. And again, it focuses on Laurie, who's a farmer's daughter, and she falls in love with Curly, who's a cowboy, and their sort of tumultuous back and forth love affair. But here's my question to all of you. Where does Oklahoma take place? It's not a trick question. So if you look at the libretto for Oklahoma, it doesn't really take place in Oklahoma. It takes place, at least when the show begins, in Indian Territory. And this is actually pretty significant. If you remember, at the end of the show, Laurie and Curly get married. And what happens also in that exact moment? Oklahoma becomes a state. So these two sort of the political and the personal stories get intertwined. But I want us to listen to a moment to the title song to see what they're singing about. And we're going to sort of put the racial stamp on why this is so important to this musical together. So here we go. Okay. So this song is a paean to, you know, the wonders of Oklahoma and this new land. And Curly even sings there, we know we belong to the land, and the land we belong to is grand. I mean, what a presumptuous statement, because, well, first off, anybody know what Oklahoma means? So it's a Choctaw Native American word that means red people. So here you have a state named after Native Americans who, of course, make no appearance at all in this show, and you have Curly and the others singing about how great this land is with not a Native American to be seen. So it's begging this question of what's the relationship of these people to the Native Americans who are not seen in Oklahoma. You should know that Oklahoma is based on a play called Green Grow the Lilacs by Lynn Riggs, who was a Native American playwright. And you know, I would make the case that this against the land, it's about all these different types of white people coming together in Oklahoma to form an identity that goes against an unseen, in this case, Native American population. But I would still argue that the Native Americans are there sort of in a phantom-like way, and to me, it's in this picture that I'm going to see. Good, you can sort of see my little moving arrow. So this is a picture of the creators of Oklahoma. This is for the 4th anniversary of Oklahoma. They had a big cake. Here's the happy 4th year anniversary. And so, as you can see my arrow, so here's Oscar Hammerstein, okay? Agnes DeMille. Here's Richard Rodgers. Some other folks at the Theater Guild. Oh, look, they're dressed up as Native Americans. The fact that they're dressing up like this, to me, indicates that they themselves, even sort of subconsciously, are aware that this is a missing part of what this story is about. So again, I want us to think about the stories that are not being told when we're looking at shows like this. This is 1943. We jump ahead 3 years, to another show, Annie, Get Your Gun. So if Oklahoma is about Native Americans who don't appear, Annie, Get Your Gun to me is about what happens when they actually do show up on stage. So here's a musical by Irving Berlin about real-life sharpshooter Annie Oakley, played by Ethel Merman. And very famously in the show, she gets, there's a Sitting Bull is a character in the show. And very famously, towards the end of Act 1, Annie Oakley gets adopted into the Sioux tribe in a very famous number, I'm an Indian Too. We're going to listen to a little bit of it because this is a number that has, people say, like, what do we make of this number? Is this pro-Native American? Is this racist? Is this, what do we do? So we're going to listen to a snip of it, and then we're going to listen to a different song to maybe put the first song in context. So we're going to listen to a snippet of Ethel Merman singing I'm an Indian Too. So just a little bit of info about this song. As you heard, there was sort of this opening sort of quasi-Native American incantation or chanting. Helen Tamiris, the choreographer, did research on Native American tribal dances. She gave them to Irving Berlin to take a look at. So there was definitely some thought put into how they wanted to capture the Native Americans in this number. In many of the critics' reviews of the show, they felt the highlight of Annie, Get Your Gun. And if you listen to the lyrics, seem to go back and forth. Though on one hand, they seem to be respectful. On the other hand, they're sort of parodic with some of these Native American names like with Runny Nose and Hatchet Face. And so, there's a case that can be made about, how do we sort of read a song like this? But I want to put this in context with another song, and I hope you'll be able to sort of, the recording's a little bit hard to hear because it's from the 1920s. But this is a song called I'm an Indian. I'm not going to tell you who the singer is. I'll see if you can guess it. But see if you can make out the lyrics, and we'll talk about these two things together. Who wrote it? It's Blanche Merrill, and I'm blanking on her co-writer. But I'll tell you this much. This will give you the reason I'm playing these two songs together. So Blanche Merrill, she was writing for the Ziegfeld Follies, and she was a one-time collaborator of Irving Berlin, who was also writing for the Follies in the 20s. Fanny Bryce, very good. So if you, I know the lyrics are a little hard to make out, but of course when you buy the books, the lyrics to both songs are complete in the book. You can compare them then. They make a picture. Okay. The lyrics are very similar. So the case I want to make here is that, this Fanny Bryce song is coming out of this style, this ethnic music sort of send-up style that was very popular in the 1920s, which Irving Berlin is also coming out of. And what's interesting, if you could hear the lyrics, so it's about Rosie Rosenstein, and Fanny Bryce is always sort of put on Yiddish accent, is saying, she's becoming an Indian, but she says, oi, 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 I'm a terrible squaw. She's basically saying, I don't make a good Indian. It's sort of the opposite of what Ethel Merman is doing in Annie, Get Your Gun. She actually wants to become part of this Native American tribe. So despite that there's this ethnic comedy tradition that Irving Berlin, I believe, is drawing on, and I believe more specifically this particular song, he's actually saying something, and if you again look at the show as a whole, the Native Americans come off pretty good in Annie, Get Your Gun in comparison to some of the other white characters. So it's interesting to sort of see these songs as a dialogue between each other, and again, different sort of racial histories in time. Okay, so we've looked at Oklahoma, we looked at Annie, Get Your Gun, 43, 46. These shows are part of what's going to start off what's known as the golden age of the Broadway musical. And from about 43 until, I would say, the mid to maybe even late 60s, we're going to get sort of the meat of what we think of as, great Broadway, whether it's My Fair Lady and Camelot and Hello Dolly, Guys and Dolls, all those shows are coming in these decades. And as part of this, we end up with West Side Story. And so this is the chapter which I'm most proud to say that came out of a lot of research here at the Library of Congress. Thank you so much to Mark. And again, what a treasure trove there is. Here's my picture of the Library of Congress. It's amazing what is here. So the Bernstein Archives, among other collections, are here. And to be able to hold, in your hands his work and to see original lyric sheets and song sheets, as well as his annotated copy of Romeo and Juliet. Pretty amazing. So what does West Side Story have to, where does it fit in? Well, on one hand, I'm sure you're thinking, well, of course, this is an obvious show about race. It's about the white Jets who are fighting the Puerto Rican sharks in the streets of New York in the 1950s. Shows from 1957. Again, music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, book by Arthur Lawrence, and the whole thing sort of concocted and choreographed by Jerome Robbins. But what people don't always know about is the back history to West Side Story, or the show that West Side Story was never the show it was going to become, if that makes sense. Rather, it was going to be East Side Story. And what, might you ask, was East Side Story going to be about? Well, it was going to be about two gangs, also modeled on William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. But in this case, it was going to be about Jews and Catholics fighting it out in the streets of New York over the Passover holiday. And and believe it or not, various scripts of various lengths were written on this topic or on this idea and then discarded. I want us to take a look at an excerpt from one so you can really get a feel for what they were working on. So I'm going to read this. Here we go. Act 2 of this draft opens with a Seder at the Capulets. Scene 1, a tenement is revealed, and we are looking into one of the upper apartments, the Capulets. To music, a Seder is in progress. The Capulet family, Juliet, Tanta, other cousins, how many, are all there. They have come to the 4 questions. Tybalt, the only child, should ask these, but he is not home. Loafing with that gang, his mother says irritably, and a cousin asks the questions. The Seder, sung in English, continues, and the background slowly is lighted. A chase happens outside with Romeo and a cop. The Seder continues, and they have reached the last of the 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn, Tybalt, who was killed by Romeo. The scene even involves the search for the hidden matzah. Wow, what if that show would have looked like? So I bet you're asking yourselves, why didn't this happen? Well, there are a few reasons. One is there was an explicit reason given by Lawrence and Bernstein and others that when they're working, the work on this show actually began fairly early in the 50s. And Arthur Lawrence is on record as saying that they're working on these drafts, and they felt the show was too much like this play Abe's Irish Rose, which was a very big Broadway play of its day, but often forgotten today. It's actually not even in print anymore, about a Jewish man and an Irish woman who fall in love. And they thought, this show feels too much like this. So work had sort of continued off and on ideas for this musical throughout the 50s. And then one day, Arthur Lawrence and Leonard Bernstein are sitting at the Beverly Hills Hotel at the pool outside, and they see that day's headlines in the paper, and I don't have the exact headline handy, but something along the lines of Chicano mayhem and violence breaks out in the streets of New York. And like this light bulb goes off in Lawrence's head and says, this is the conflict. It's not this Jewish Catholic fighting. It's this white and now Puerto Rican fighting that's happening. And Bernstein was excited because he said, oh, I can hear the Latin rhythms in my head. And they call Jerome Robbins, and he loves the idea. And sort of after that moment, sort of the West Side Story really begins to come into play. I want to put another reading on top of this, though, that goes back to where I was talking about sort of changing ideas of race and whiteness. So it's not only, I think, that the original show was too much like Abe's Irish Rose, it's that in the mid-century, the after World War II, the 40s into the 50s, white identity is changing, particularly for Jews, Irish, and Italians. And these groups that were once apart from the larger white and Caucasian racial category are now becoming part of white mainstream, and non-whites are sort of this new outside group in the US, or more so the line between whites and non-whites becomes much more demarcated. And that, to me, is actually what we're seeing in here. It's not just that it was too much like Abe's Irish Rose, it's that there really wasn't a conflict racially between Jews and Catholics that made sense. And there were things in letters between Lawrence and Robbins that, again, all this is in the book, that sort of talk subtly, but I think subtly and yet also explicitly about these racial issues that we can sort of track why it went from East Side Story to West Side Story. There's something else I want to throw into all this, is to think about what's happening politically, but also musical theater-wise in 1957. We think of West Side Story today as this big game changer for the American musical. It was one of the first shows to really use dance in a very sophisticated way. A lot of the story is told through dance. West Side Story was not the huge hit it sort of we think it to be today. It actually opened to mixed reviews, and it did not win the Tony Award for Best Musical that year. Any idea what show did? The Music Man. I would also argue, Music Man I think is a good show. I think it's also a sophisticated show. But think about what these two shows are about. One is about warring gangs in the streets of New York over racial politics, and the other is a throwback to small town, here's where I'm going to insert the word, white America, right, in which everybody is basically alike except for this, con artist who comes into town and shakes up the town. But it's this very nostalgic throwback to a period in history where people of color aren't even present. And if you read the reviews of both shows, again, West Side Story, mixed reviews, people went gaga over The Music Man and its embrace of sort of patriotism and all of that. And so I think its racial politics actually helped to contribute to the success of the show. And you should know it's just, I think the year, I'm going to get these dates wrong, it's either the year before and or after that shows such as Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver hit the airwaves. Other shows that are sort of indulging in this, oh, look how perfect sort of white suburbia and white life is. So there's The Music Man for you. We're going to more or less leave the Golden Age, and I want us to take a peek at an interesting phenomenon that happens at the end of the 60s into the 70s, with actually even a few examples still today. And this is what I call, these are what I believe to be black productions of white musicals, or try to say traditionally white musicals. In the moment of civil rights and black power, Broadway too was changing, especially as the 60s and 70s were going on. And beginning in 67, we get an all-black production of the musical Hello, Dolly, starring Pearl Bailey. And it wasn't just that Pearl Bailey took over in the lead role, it's that they cast the entire production with black actors. And this, for critics, was sort of like head-scratching, like, is this a positive move for black actors? Or is this some sort of like, I don't know, type of like minstrelsy where, where these actors are sort of playing roles that should only be played by white actors? I want us to take a look, actually, at an example, and give me one moment. So I want to take a quick look at this production. So the show went great with the critics, and it even said, you should know, the Black Company premiered here at the National Theater in DC, and it set new box office records when it premiered here. If you read the criticism around these productions, so there was this production of Hello, Dolly, there was an all-black production of Guys and Dolls in 1975, a show called Timbuktu, which was an all-black production or version of Kismet. There was an interracial pajama game in the 1970s, and even an all-black company of the show I Love My Wife. And there were these questions about, these shows which people didn't think about having anything to do with race before. Once they were inhabited by non-white actors, all these sort of questions and for some people flags were going up. And so it forced people to sort of challenge their assumptions about the racelessness of these shows. And so, for example, one thing critics were asking about Hello, Dolly was, where was this all-black community of African Americans in 1890s Yonkers? so there are a lot of questions about cross-racial casting and interracial casting that shows like this brought up. Just in passing, well, this was, I think, a main phenomenon of the 1970s. Every now and then you still see this. And just 2 weeks ago, I was in LA giving a talk, and I got to see Kiss Me Kate in an all-black production at Pasadena Playhouse with Wayne Brady, if you know the comedian Wayne Brady. It's interesting because sometimes these shows aren't successful. In this, if you know Kiss Me Kate, I'll just tell you in passing. At one point, the main star Lily Vanessy is in love in this production with a white general in 1946 or whatever, 48. And this question of like, what's the credibility of and they're talking on stage. Here are the actual, lines from Kiss Me Kate about, he's saying to her, and you're going to be first lady one day. And you're thinking, what U.S. history are we looking at when, we just had the Obamas in office? How, so it's, some things, we can't seem to look past, the actual, and sometimes sad as it is, racial histories of the U.S. Just a couple more shows, and we're going to take some questions. So we got through the 60s, and then 1975, we get to A Chorus Line. Again, another big sort of game changer for Broadway musicals. Goes on to win not only Best Musical, but the Pulitzer Prize, and becomes, until Cats, the longest-running musical in Broadway history. It's about a group of people auditioning for a chorus line, and the show, this idea that, everybody's on the line, that resonated, I think, with a lot of people. The music was great. It had a lot of fans. But what I want us to think about A Chorus Line is not only, and I think what also perhaps made it successful is its racial politics. So A Chorus Line has, one might argue, the most multi-ethnic, multi-racial company of actors in any show. If you're familiar with it, there's an African-American dancer, an Asian-American dancer, 2 Latino dancers, there's Italian-Americans, some are, the dancers are gay, some are straight. A real sort of spectrum of American society. And what's interesting is that A Chorus Line is very much like 42nd Street, where we began, because the ideology of A Chorus Line says it doesn't matter what your background is, the best people will get the job. And maybe while that has been changing in the 1970s, what's interesting to me is that the history of chorus lines themselves, less so now, but actually still to an extent this is the case, the history of a chorus line was predicated not only on the idea that the singers and dancers are moving in sort of lockstep together, but that they actually share the same racial background. And so, when you're looking at chorus lines, let's say from the era of Ziegfeld, it's only white women, and a particular type of white woman of sort of Nordic heritage, who can be part of that chorus line. And so while things had definitely changed in the 1970s, I think there's a naivete to a chorus line in that, again, it believes, oh, anybody can get a job, and yet things hadn't quite gotten there in the US. So some interesting politics of this show. And in the book, you can take a look. There actually were some songs written about racial identity that never made it into the musical, and you can read those lyrics and sort of why they were cut in the book. The last sort of show or type of show I want us to look at are what I call new old shows. What are these? So in the 1980s and 1990s, and even up until today, a few types of musicals came onto the scene. We began seeing a lot of revived musicals in the 1980s, but not just revivals, but what I call, or some people have called, revisals, in which shows that were once thought to be either politically incorrect or whose books didn't really sort of speak to contemporary audiences were actually rewritten to make them more palatable for contemporary audiences. So Annie Get Your Gun got a brand new book. What do? They just cut out songs like I'm an Indian Too and rewrote it to make the Native American characters less stereotypical. Flower Drum Song got a new book by David Henry Wong to update it. So you have shows like that. And one might argue that those were ways to, again, maybe to sort of stay with this theme, to sort of whitewash history, again, to sort of change the racial context that originally went with them to make them speak to our current moment. But the other show we get this sort of new old show, are shows that are new, but based on older types of material. 42nd Street falls into that category, but also a show like, I have to leave the PowerPoint, a show, The Will Rogers Follies, which actually is about the performer Will Rogers. And this is a show from 1991. It won Best Musical that year. And the conceit of the show is that it tells the life of Will Rogers, but in the framework of the Ziegfeld Follies. And I want to look at an excerpt of a number, and I'm going to talk about it. This very over-the-top patriotic number in Act 2. I'm just tired watching it. Good choreography by Tommy Tune here. If you we're taking a look at the faces on screen here, not a person of color among them. Was this an accident? Hard to say, but the producers of Will Rogers Follies were taken to task by Actors Equity for not hiring any non-white actors in their cast. The producers said, "Oh, we couldn't find any. We put out a call, and there just weren't enough African-American women or anybody else to hire." The rumor going around, though, was that Tommy Tune, the director-choreographer, cast the show in this way to recapture the all-white nature of the Ziegfeld Follies themselves. Whether or not that's true, it is hard to say, but would sort of explain this casting choice, and it was only after this Actors Equity complaint that some African-American chorus members were added into the show. The show actually was also taken to task by the Native American community for its depiction of Native Americans, considering that Will Rogers was part Cherokee Indian, and they didn't like the way that Native Americans were portrayed either. So the show got 2 thumbs down, and again, that show that seems to be nothing about race had it written all over the place. The last place, and I'm only for time, I'm not going to show a clip, but when I was finishing the book, I was trying to figure out, well, have things changed for the Broadway musical? Have we progressed? Have things become more inclusive or more diverse? And the answer was mixed. There are examples of things. It's great to hear that Stu's going to be here, because I mentioned Passing Strange in the book. If you're not familiar with that show, it's a great show about this African-American singer, musician, coming of age. And the book, my book actually ends with a discussion of the Scottsboro Boys, which I think is a tremendous musical about the real-life case of the 8 African-American young men who were unjustly accused of raping 2 white women in the 30s. Again, not what we might think of as musical material, but it's a tremendous show. Anybody get to see it? Did it come to DC? No. Oh, it's a shame. It was. Yeah, it's been lots of places, but not to all cities. It's a big show to produce. But to me, there's a lot more work to be done. So there are handfuls of shows like this which are putting new other people's lives on stage. In the Heights, I talk about, finally showing a show written by and starring, Latinos. But if you really look at what's being produced still, there's still a lot of whiteness on Broadway, both on what's being produced, the actors who are inhabiting those roles, and the question of how do we change this? We can point the finger at producers, and they have some responsibility, but I actually point the finger at us as well. And that when we're standing in line or deciding what we want to go and see, it's like we should put our money at other things. And so, I used to stand a lot in the half-price line in New York. We can go and see, The Producers or whatever is playing right now, Beautiful, the Carole King musical, or we can put our money to the Scottsboro Boys. Not enough people showed up to the Scottsboro Boys to keep it open. So it's actually also in our hands about the type of work that, if we make our voices heard, there'll be other things out there. So I'm going to end the talk there. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm happy to take some questions and leave it there.
A couple of questions in terms of black production, white productions, like white musicals, or black productions of white musicals, as you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue, though, that to some extent the motivation behind them was driven by white financing.
Oh, yeah.
And those were not, blacks did not finance those shows.
You're definitely correct, and I'll just say 2 things to that. So David Merrick, who was the producer behind Hello Dolly, he wasn't being, he smelled cash cow when he was doing this. He had very specific interests. So he's a great example of definitely right, sort of white maneuvering behind the scenes. And I'm trying to think who it was. It was, I'm blanking on the name, maybe somebody will remember, the director of the All Black Guys and Dolls. His name goes out of my head. But he says, and it's in the book, he says on record, he says, you know, he was seeing this as sort of as a I don't know, stopgap measure, saying like, when we, the black community, has our own money, our own money, we will produce really what we want to produce. And this is sort of a gesture, like this is what we can do right now. He basically is saying that. So they weren't, I think they were sort of, that community was taking what they could get at that time. And that's, I think, why we can look at it in different ways. So you're right.
One other quick question. Before you invest, I understand in Gershwin's, I guess it's Gershwin family that retains the rights to it. There is a stipulation that we only have an all-black cast. Is that still true?
I don't know. That makes sense. I don't know of any production that goes against that, but it seems like a reasonable stipulation and one that would make sense.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, please.
I have 3 little comments.
Okay.
How about ragtime?
Yeah, folks, we got to get on mic with the questions.
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Thank you. How about,
Yeah, you're good.
how about Ragtime, which has a nice mixed
Yeah.
cast and mixed status and history thing, and Avenue Q. Even though there aren't humans,
Right. No, I see. No, I know.
but it covers a whole lot.
I know. I mentioned Avenue Q in the book, and at the end, and I say it's not only what I say, like it's not only multi-ethnic, or multicultural. It's multi puppet or whatever it is. It's got everything. No, you're right. So those are examples of shows that are engaging with race in very, I think, in smart ways, in very contemporary ways that are that are great. A lot of what I was interested in this book and talking about were ways, looking at shows that were important to American musical theater, but people hadn't thought, I think, about dealing with racial topics.
And the last thing is, there have been a lot of Showboat versions, good and bad, most of them bad. But the best one probably is the 1936 one with Irene Dunn, who does a mean shuffle. It is hilarious.
Well, and so you have to get the book because I talk all about that shuffle.
Well, okay.
In the book, because no, it's interesting how it is about performance and about when she shuffles. It's about like how do white people act, and when she's doing the shuffle, and then when all the black chorus members around her are doing it as well. And it's interesting, like it's both funny, but it's, I don't know, I think there's something it's saying about like how different groups are supposed to perform. And I think we're supposed to laugh at her. I think that's a good recording or sort of version of that show, though. So, yeah.
We have time for one last question, then you can speak with Warren privately while he's signing books. And I'm going to take that question if it's okay. The question I have is, how much responsibility with changing the course of minority racial representation on Broadway falls to the headliners? I don't want to name names, but there are a lot of people who make it to the top in Broadway who are not white, Caucasian, Aryan types. And they do really well for themselves, but could they be more vocal about trying to get an equal representation on Broadway?
It's a really good question. Just this summer, there was a production of Gypsy that featured Leslie Uggams out in Connecticut. It's interesting. Here's a major actress, right, a force of nature, who, my sense is, makes a great Mama Rose. And what do we do with the fact that the history of it is, Rose and Louise, they weren't black, but why should this stop a great actress playing this role? And, also this summer I went to see Lillias White, if you know her, a great, great actress from The Life. I went to see her cabaret show in New York. And she did a tear down the walls version of Don't Rain on My Parade from Funny Girl. And all I could think of sitting there and watching this is, I want to see your production of Funny Girl, right? And so I think, you know, the short is we haven't gotten there yet. Audra McDonald is probably the one person who's been able to sort of make that jump. In 110 in the Shade, she starred. And if you saw, when the production was in New York, you know, they were able to. This is my reading of the show. It's about the daughter who hasn't fallen in love, and this guy comes to town, and the two of them get together. And in the plays, John Cullum, white actor, plays her father, and she had two brothers in this production. One of them was played by a white actor, and one of them was played by a black actor. So without anything having been said, and the mother is dead. So the narrative I thought we were meant to believe is that they were an interracial family, and this explains the composition of of how it works. And therefore, my sense is this is how we can take it to be believable. So I think there are ways that casting does work without even have to change an ounce of the text. But then you get productions like that Kiss Me Kate I saw, and it was a lot of like, I don't understand how this works, because how do you have this interracial, high-profile love relationship going on in 1940 whatever? So, you know, I think we'll see where things will change. You know, one of the places where casting sort of totally, maybe happily goes out the window is with amateur and like high school productions, where I think my high school had, a Japanese American student playing, Tevye. And why not? He was the best person to play Tevye, so go for it. So there's a lot of work left to be done, but I think that's where we'll leave it. Okay.
This may be a vague question, so I apologize if it is. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on Jason Robert Brown's Parade, because I know obviously that it takes place and like it's based on a really sad true story,
Yeah.
but it has a lot to do with racial and religious tension. I just wanted to know if you had any comments on that.
Yes. I would just say you're right. I mean, I think it does deal with race in very smart ways. I think it's beautiful music. The show doesn't always sort of work for me personally, sort of in a narrative sense. But again, I think it's interesting the way it's looking at in that show. You know, Jewish identity isn't quite white identity in that show, right? Leo Frank is in his own sort of racial category, and the way that that's played against the black narratives in the show is quite interesting. So it's complex. Thank you so much for coming out today. Enjoy.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.